The chamber was restless, murmurs drifting like static before a storm. At the center of it all, Kash Patel leaned back with the smug ease of a man certain the spotlight belonged to him. His smirk sharpened as he looked across the table, waiting for his moment. And then it came. His voice rose, slick with arrogance, dripping with disdain. A jab wrapped in the confidence of someone who had made a career out of belittling others. He dismissed Jasmine Crockett with a single line meant to reduce her, to laugh her out of the room, to remind her of where he thought she stood. The air thickened. His words hovered, sharp, meant to wound. A few gasps, a few chuckles from those who fed on insult as if it were truth. Patel basked in it, confident the blow had landed. But then came the silence. Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't scramble for words. She didn't shrink into the corner Patel had painted for her. Instead, she fixed him with a gaze so steady it cut deeper than any rebuttal. She leaned back, eyes locked, letting the silence grow louder than his insult. The crowd shifted, sensing something they couldn't yet name. That pause, sharp, deliberate, wasn't weakness. It was power. In that moment, Patel's smirk faltered. Just slightly. The arrogance of the room wavered, balanced on the knife's edge of her silence. She let him sit with it, let him feel the weight of his own words turning heavy in the stillness. And then came the turn. The narrator's voice cut through, echoing what everyone in the room and at home would soon realize. In that moment, everyone thought she would shrink. Instead, she rose. The silence wasn't surrender. It was the wind-up, the breath before the storm. The room leaned in, 1,000 eyes waiting, 1,000 hearts pounding in sync. What would she say? How could she answer the kind of insult designed to humiliate, to erase, to make her invisible? The tension coiled, electric, impossible to ignore. And just when the moment reached its breaking point, when Patel's smirk struggled to hold its ground, Jasmine Crockett opened her mouth. What came out of her mouth next would leave even Patel speechless. To understand why this clash mattered, you have to step back and see the battlefield it was born on. This wasn't just a committee hearing, another headline in the endless churn of politics. This was the arena where America's future is contested word by word, where every exchange carries the weight of who gets to define truth, dignity, and belonging. Kash Patel had built his name in these spaces, sharp elbows, louder than the facts, always ready with the kind of smug jab that played well to those who mistook arrogance for strength. He thrived on the dismissive laugh, the rolling eyes, the quick quip that made others appear small. It was his brand, his strategy, and too often it worked. Against those unprepared, his taunts landed like punches. But Jasmine Crockett was not unprepared. She walked into that chamber carrying more than a title or a microphone. She carried the weight of her community, of her story, of every person who had ever been underestimated, told to wait their turn, told to sit down. She carried the fire of someone who had fought in courtrooms, on the streets, in the halls of power, and refused to bow. That's what Patel didn't see. That's what made the moment dangerous for him. The stakes weren't just about Crockett defending herself against a cheap insult. They were about whether truth still had power in an age of bluster, whether composure could still break through arrogance. If Patel could humiliate her, his side would claim victory. Another viral clip, another smug soundbite. But if Crockett could flip the script, if she could expose him, it would be more than a personal win. It would be a cultural thunderclap. And the room felt it. Reporters scribbled, cameras clicked, staffers leaned forward in their chairs. Even those who weren't fans of Crockett could sense the weight of the moment. There are times in politics where the noise is all that matters. And then there are times when the noise stops, when every eye locks onto a single exchange, when history waits to see who blinks first. This was one of those times. The narrator's voice sharpened. This wasn't just a skirmish. This was a duel for the soul of the debate itself. Was America going to keep rewarding arrogance, or would dignity finally take the microphone back? And just when Patel thought he had seized control, the silence that followed hinted otherwise. Everyone leaned closer. They knew something was coming, something that wouldn't just answer Patel's smug line, but shatter it, something that would echo far beyond the walls of that chamber. Because this wasn't only about Patel and Crockett. It was about every immigrant who had been told they didn't belong, Every woman told her voice didn't matter. Every community laughed at by those in power. The air was heavy with expectation. Crockett hadn't spoken yet, but already the balance had shifted. Already the audience knew they weren't just watching a rebuttal. They were about to witness a reckoning. And that's when the story takes us deeper, into the man who thought he could own the room, into Kash Patel himself and the arrogance that would soon collapse under the weight of one line. To understand why Kash Patel walked into that room so sure of himself, you have to trace the story that made him. He wasn't just another face in Washington. He was a creation of its darkest machinery, molded by proximity to power and sharpened by loyalty to those who thrived on chaos. Patel rose in the shadows, staff roles, council jobs, behind-the-scenes operator. He wasn't a household name to most Americans, but in the circles that craved disruption, he was the insider's insider. He had carved out a place for himself as the bulldog who would do what others wouldn't: twist the knife, carry the attack, smear the opponent until the truth was buried under noise. That reputation, whispered in backrooms and celebrated in partisan corners, was his armor. And Patel wore it proudly. He cultivated an image of a man who laughed at civility, who believed power belonged not to the careful but to the loud. His trademark was the smirk, that sly, cutting half-smile that told you he was certain he was the smartest person in the room. He used it often, a weapon as sharp as any word. When Patel smirked, it meant he thought he had you right where he wanted you, small, cornered, defenseless. It was a performance, but one that often worked. Many who crossed paths with him, caught off guard by the arrogance, stumbled. That was Patel's calculation: overwhelm them, bulldoze them, leave them scrambling while he basked in the victory. He thrived in the chaos he helped create, because in chaos, truth doesn't matter, only who speaks loudest. But arrogance has a way of becoming blindness, and Patel was blind to what sat across from him that day. To him, Jasmine Crockett was just another opponent to dismiss, another voice to mock into silence. He thought the playbook would hold: jab hard, throw her off, get the crowd chuckling, and walk away with another clip to share with his allies. He thought her silence would mean defeat, that she wouldn't have the fire to push back. But Patel underestimated her, and his underestimation came from something deeper than strategy. It came from entitlement, from the belief that women like Crockett, especially women of color, were supposed to stay in their place, to know their limits, to fold under pressure. That belief wasn't new. It was the foundation on which his smirk had been built. The irony, of course, is that his arrogance made him fragile. He wasn't prepared for someone who refused to play the game on his terms. He wasn't prepared for composure instead of fluster, for silence instead of stumbling words, for dignity instead of panic. The armor he thought was unbreakable was in fact glass, and Crockett was about to shatter it with a single strike. But before that moment, Patel basked. He relished the cameras, knowing this clip would circulate. He played to his base, those who cheered swagger over substance. He wasn't worried about being right, he was worried about being loud, and in his mind, loud always won. What Patel didn't realize was that the tide of politics was shifting. People were tired of arrogance masquerading as strength. They were hungry for authenticity, for courage, for leaders who didn't confuse bullying with conviction. And Jasmine Crockett represented exactly that. In his backstory lies the irony of this clash. Patel had spent years learning how to weaponize arrogance, only to meet the one person in that room who could dismantle it with calm. His rise in the shadows, his loyalty to power, his cultivated smirk, it all led to this moment, a stage where his greatest weapon would become his undoing. The narrator's voice deepens. Kash Patel believed he owned the room. What he didn't know was that he had just walked into the trap of his own making. And as the cameras rolled, the story shifted. The arrogance of Patel would only matter in contrast to the resilience of the woman sitting across from him. The villain's smirk was set. The stage was prepared. The audience was waiting. Because this wasn't just about Patel's story. It was about the clash between entitlement and dignity, and what happened when those two collided would rewrite the narrative. The smirk was still on his face, but it wouldn't last. Jasmine Crockett did not arrive in that chamber by accident. Her presence was not the product of luck, nor of quiet privilege. It was the culmination of a life defined by grit, sacrifice, and a refusal to bow to the weight of obstacles. To understand the power of that single moment against Kash Patel, you have to understand the woman behind it, the trials she carried, the fire she nurtured, the strength she forged in the crucible of struggle. Her story begins far from the marble walls of Congress. Crockett grew up in a world where the path was never paved smooth, where every step forward required defiance of the limits others tried to place on her. She knew what it meant to be underestimated, to be told, "Not you," in 1,000 subtle and not-so-subtle ways. And yet, with every dismissal, she grew sharper. With every obstacle, she grew stronger. The courtroom became her proving ground. Law school was not just an education for Crockett, it was a battlefield. While others walked through doors opened by connections, she had to carve her way in, holding her head high while others doubted whether she belonged. Those long nights bent over law books were not only about learning statutes. They were about proving, day after day, that she was not going anywhere. Her mind became a weapon, her words honed into steel. And when she emerged as a lawyer, it was with a mission: to defend those whose voices were ignored, to fight for those pushed to the margins. She did not chase power for its own sake. She chased justice. And justice, in Crockett's hands, became something alive, urgent, tangible, rooted in the dignity of ordinary people. She stood for immigrants fighting to prove their worth, for working families whose voices were drowned out by billionaires, for communities tired of being told they didn't matter. Each case she took, each client she defended, built her into something more than a lawyer. She became a fighter. And fighting meant sacrifice. There were nights she went without sleep, mornings she walked into hostile rooms where the odds were stacked high against her. There were days she endured ridicule, sneers, even threats. But each time she refused to bend. Each time she remembered who she was fighting for: the single mother holding down 2 jobs, the young student told they'd never rise, the immigrant who had given everything for a chance at belonging. When Crockett entered politics, she carried that same spirit. She wasn't a polished insider. She wasn't there to play games. She came armed with authenticity, with the raw truth of someone who had lived what she spoke. That authenticity made her dangerous to men like Patel. Because where Patel dealt in arrogance and performance, Crockett dealt in lived experience and courage. She didn't have to pretend. She was the real thing. Her rise was not meteoric in the glamorous sense. It was steady, relentless, carved out of every insult, every no, every door slammed in her face. And with each barrier, she found another way through. That resilience became her hallmark. People began to see in her not just a politician, but a mirror of their own struggles. She represented the America that worked twice as hard for half as much, the America that refused to be erased. And so, on the day she sat across from Patel, she carried more than herself into that chamber. She carried 1,000 stories, 1,000 faces, 1,000 battles fought in silence. She carried the weight of communities who rarely saw themselves defended on that stage. She knew exactly what was at stake. This wasn't just a sparring match. This was a moment where truth had to cut through arrogance. The irony was almost poetic. Patel thought he faced another opponent to bulldoze. In reality, he faced a woman whose entire life had been about refusing to be bulldozed. The very silence Patel mistook for weakness was the same silence she had used all her life to measure, to steady, to prepare before delivering the blow that would leave her adversaries reeling. The narrator's voice rises. This was not the silence of fear. This was the silence of calculation, the silence of a woman who knew her power. Crockett's composure, her refusal to flinch, came from years of practice. Years of enduring taunts far worse than Patel's. Years of walking into rooms where every eye doubted her. She had learned to let others underestimate her, because underestimation was her greatest weapon. It lulled opponents into thinking she could be dismissed, only to find themselves undone when she spoke. And Patel, arrogant in his entitlement, had fallen right into that trap. The crowd didn't know it yet, but the stage was already set. Patel thought he was in control, but Crockett was the one holding the weight of the room. All those years of resilience, all those battles fought in silence, were converging here now in this one confrontation. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need theatrics. Her strength came from within, and it radiated through the calm with which she met Patel's smirk. The narrator steadies. She didn't come to bow, she came ready to expose. And as the silence stretched, as the crowd leaned closer, the balance tipped. Patel thought he had landed his blow. In reality, he had only given Crockett the opening she had been waiting for. The audience would soon see why her backstory mattered, why every battle she had fought, every insult she had endured, had prepared her for this exact moment. The silence was almost unbearable, but the storm was coming. The silence lingered like smoke, curling through the chamber, drawing every gaze toward the face-off at its center. Patel, sensing the pause stretched too long for comfort, leaned forward, his smirk hardening into something more brittle. He jabbed again, louder this time, his voice sharpened with impatience. The words spilled out rapid and mocking, as if volume alone could rescue him from the weight of the quiet Crockett held over him. "See, nothing to say," he scoffed, his tone soaked in triumph. "All talk when the cameras are off, but when you're here, when it matters, silence is all you've got." The chuckles of his allies rang hollow, but they were enough to give Patel fuel. He pressed on, interruption after interruption, cutting across her attempts to begin. Each barb was designed not to debate, but to derail. His eyes flicked toward the cameras with every jab, playing for the clip, for the viral moment, for the echo chamber that cheered arrogance as though it were courage. But Crockett did not take the bait. She sat unmoving, her composure radiating. Every time Patel pushed harder, every time his voice rose, she leaned back just slightly, letting his desperation hang in the air. Her stillness began to sting, as though her refusal to rise to his level was itself an indictment. The crowd noticed it, the tilt of heads, the murmurs rippling through the chamber, the unspoken question, why isn't she rattled? The truth was simple. Crockett knew his playbook. She had seen this script before, the bully who thought chaos was strength, who believed interruption was intelligence, who imagined arrogance could substitute for argument. And she knew the power of letting him talk too much. Because with each word, Patel revealed more than he intended. The confidence of his first jab was fraying. What had begun as dismissive swagger was unraveling into overcompensation. His voice carried a sharpness now, not of control, but of a man trying too hard to hold onto dominance that was slipping away. The chamber itself seemed to turn. Those who laughed at his first barb grew quiet as his interruptions piled on. The smirk that once looked like confidence now looked like desperation. The more he spoke, the less powerful he seemed. And all the while, Crockett's silence grew heavier, more commanding. She waited, eyes fixed on him, calm and unbothered. To the audience, it was as though she were holding a blade still sheathed, while Patel flailed wildly with dull weapons. The anticipation built, thick and electric. Narrator's voice pierced the tension. He mistook her calm for surrender, but what he didn't see was that she was letting him dig his own grave, word by word, interruption by interruption. Patel leaned back again, out of breath from his own performance. He let out a laugh, the nervous kind that betrays more than it conceals. For a moment, he basked in what he thought was dominance. The crowd watched. The silence returned, and Crockett leaned in ever so slightly. That was all it took for the room to shift once more. Every eye swung back to her, every ear strained for what would come next. The murmurs hushed into silence, the kind of silence that feels alive, pressing against the walls. Crockett inhaled. Patel froze. The crowd held its breath. The narrator deepens. The escalation had reached its peak. Patel thought he had cornered her. What he didn't realize was that she had been waiting for this exact moment, when his arrogance was stretched so thin it could snap with a single word. Her lips parted, her voice was coming. And what came out would not just be an answer, it would be a reckoning. The silence had stretched to its limit, so heavy it felt like it might crack the air itself. Every eye was on Jasmine Crockett. Every camera tightened its lens. Kash Patel leaned back, smug but uneasy, his laughter faltering just enough for the world to notice. This was the pause before the storm, the stillness that makes thunder inevitable. And then she spoke. Her voice was calm, even almost gentle, so different from Patel's sharp interruptions that the contrast itself landed like a blow. She didn't shout. She didn't match his volume. She didn't need to. Her words carried the weight of truth, and truth doesn't need to scream. "You can call me whatever you like, Mr. Patel," she said, her eyes locked on his. "But the difference between us is simple. I'm here to serve the people. You're here to serve yourself." The line sliced clean through the noise. For a heartbeat, there was nothing. No laughter, no interruptions, not even the sound of scribbling pens. Patel blinked, the grin stiffening on his face like a mask that no longer fit. The audience, sensing the gravity of the moment, inhaled as one. And then the eruption came. Gasps first, then a ripple of murmurs, then the unmistakable wave of applause and cheers that began in the corners of the hall and surged like a tide toward the center. Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't ride the applause, didn't gesture or smile. She stood in stillness, letting the noise affirm what everyone had just witnessed. The balance of power had shifted. Patel raised a hand, desperate to wave it off, but the timing betrayed him. The crowd wasn't ready to let go. His attempt to reclaim control made him look smaller, not larger. Crockett's words had trapped him in the simplest of cages, the truth, plainly spoken. But she wasn't done. "You spent years defending those who broke the law, those who tore at the fabric of this democracy for profit and power," she continued, her voice steady as stone. "And now you sit here, mocking the very institutions you weakened, mocking anyone who dares stand up to you. That's not strength. That's cowardice dressed as bravado." The audience reacted audibly again, but this time it wasn't just shock. It was recognition. They had heard those arguments before. Shouted on TV, typed in furious tweets. But here it was, crystallized into sentences so sharp they could cut glass, delivered by someone unshaken. Patel shifted in his seat. His smirk had curdled into something closer to a grimace, though he tried to disguise it with another hollow chuckle. "Please," he muttered, loud enough for the mic to pick up, "spare me the lecture." But Crockett wasn't sparing anything. "You think this is a game," she said, her tone tightening just a fraction, her gaze never wavering. "That's why you laugh. That's why you dismiss. Because deep down, you know if you ever took it seriously, if you ever stood in the shoes of the people you pretend to defend, you'd crumble under the weight of responsibility." The room froze again. It was as though every spectator, every viewer on the live stream, every person scrolling on their phones miles away, felt the words land at the same time. Responsibility. It was the very word Patel had spent years dodging, the very concept his critics used against him. And now it was hanging in the air like a verdict. For a split second, Patel looked as though he might respond. His lips parted, his fingers twitched on the table. But nothing came. The confidence that had carried him through countless interviews, panels, and speeches had deserted him at the one moment he needed it most. Crockett leaned forward slightly, enough to break the stillness without breaking her composure. "You can dismiss me, Mr. Patel," she said, softer now, almost intimate. "But you cannot dismiss the people I represent. Every time you sneer at me, you sneer at them. Every insult you throw my way, every laugh at my expense, it's really aimed at the single mom trying to keep her lights on, at the veteran fighting for health care, at the immigrant child who still believes America has a place for her." The applause that followed wasn't sudden this time. It built slowly, like a fire catching across dry grass, spreading until the hall was vibrating with it. Viewers at home would later replay this moment, over and over, not for the spectacle but for the clarity. Crockett wasn't just speaking to Patel. She was speaking through him, to the millions who had grown tired of arrogance passing as authority. And still, she wasn't finished. "You may win in the short term with mockery and noise," she concluded, her voice now carrying the full resonance of conviction. "But in the long run, service will always outlast selfishness. Truth will always outshine spin. And dignity," she paused, letting the words sink in, "dignity will always silence contempt." It was the closest thing to a mic drop one could deliver in a congressional hearing, and it landed with the force of a gavel. Patel sat motionless, pinned in place not by Crockett's volume, but by the inescapable weight of her words. The audience, half stunned, half electrified, reacted in waves. Some leapt to their feet, unable to contain their energy. Others simply sat frozen, their eyes wide, their jaws slack, knowing they had just witnessed a moment that would be replayed for years. Patel, once so confident, now seemed to shrink. His smirk was gone. His hands fidgeted against one another. He attempted a laugh, but the sound fell flat, hollow, drowned beneath the echo of Crockett's words. And Crockett? She returned to her seat as though nothing extraordinary had happened, as though she hadn't just dismantled her opponent with precision and grace. That, perhaps, was the most devastating move of all. She gave the impression that this wasn't her grand finale. It was simply her truth, spoken plainly. For a few seconds more, the room remained suspended in that energy. Applause still rumbling, murmurs still flying. Patel's silence more eloquent than anything he could have said. And the viewers at home, they knew exactly what had just happened. A moment when arrogance collided with dignity, and dignity prevailed. But even then, none of them were prepared for what came next. Because the shockwaves of Crockett's words weren't confined to that hearing room. They were about to spill into living rooms, news cycles, and timelines across the nation, igniting a reaction no one, least of all Patel, saw coming. The moment Crockett spoke, the room seemed to vibrate with a new energy. The silence that had held the chamber captive broke, not gently, but like a wave crashing against a cliff. Applause erupted first in fits, then in a rolling tide that no one could contain. Standing ovations, cheers, whistles, it all collided into a single, unbroken declaration. The moment had landed. But the echo didn't stop there. Within minutes, clips began circulating on social media. Phones raised, cameras rolling, viewers capturing every second of Patel's faltering composure and Crockett's calm precision. Hashtags ignited across platforms. Crockett wins, truth over arrogance, mic drop moment. The clip became a viral sensation almost immediately, shared by ordinary citizens, journalists, and activists alike, each framing it in their own terms. A woman speaking truth to power, a masterclass in dignity, a single line that spoke for millions. Commentators scrambled to catch up. Morning shows, political podcasts, and late-night panels replayed the clip, dissecting it frame by frame. Analysts who had dismissed Crockett's chances as negligible suddenly had to acknowledge the spectacle of her mastery. The conversation shifted, not just about what she said, but about what it represented, a triumph of composure over arrogance, service over self-interest. Even those skeptical of her politics found themselves nodding, caught in the undeniable force of her words. Memes began to circulate too, capturing the exact moment Patel's smirk faltered, juxtaposed with Crockett's calm gaze. Each one amplified the story, transforming a single hearing into a nationwide moment of cultural reckoning. Tweets and posts flowed in waves. Admiration, shock, outrage at Patel, praise for Crockett. She had become a symbol not just of political skill, but of something deeper: resilience, dignity, and the power of preparation. The ripple effect extended beyond the digital sphere. Fellow politicians began to reference the exchange in interviews, some aligning with Crockett's stance, others forced to reckon with the spectacle she had created. Editorial boards praised her clarity and courage. Late-night hosts replayed the one line over and over, analyzing every inflection, every pause, every reaction. It became clear that this wasn't a moment contained to a single room. It was a turning point in the narrative around both figures. For Patel, the aftermath was unrelenting. The viral clip followed him from social media feeds to news segments, a constant reminder of his miscalculation. The smirk he had relied on as armor had crumbled into a symbol of failure. Analysts and pundits dissected his reaction, highlighting the arrogance that had led him into a trap he never saw coming. Every public appearance became a chance for comparison, and every comparison favored Crockett. Meanwhile, for Crockett, the moment was transformative. She did not revel in mockery or spectacle. Instead, she leaned into the impact of her words, allowing them to stand as a testament to the power of preparation, truth, and composure. Communities that had followed her work felt vindicated, inspired, and energized. Immigrant groups, advocacy organizations, and everyday citizens shared the clip with pride, seeing in her victory the affirmation of their own struggles and values. The narrative had shifted. Where Patel's arrogance once dominated the room, now it was Crockett's integrity, her measured response, her unwavering focus that defined the story. The chamber, the cameras, and the viewers had witnessed a demonstration of political skill that transcended partisanship. It was no longer a simple debate. It was a lesson in courage, a validation of identity, and a cinematic display of the timeless truth that dignity can dismantle even the most calculated bluster. The narrator's voice cuts in, resonant and deliberate. In the days that followed, the clip spread like wildfire, not because of drama alone, but because it carried meaning. Millions saw what happens when preparation meets courage, when dignity meets arrogance, and when one person refuses to be silenced. Patel's words were forgotten almost instantly. Crockett's voice became the echo heard across the nation. Even weeks later, the aftermath continued to unfold. Op-eds, interviews, viral commentaries, and social media tributes all pointed to the same conclusion. This moment had broken through the usual churn of politics to deliver a lesson in morality, composure, and service. It was an affirmation to all who felt dismissed, underestimated, or silenced, that power is not always measured by volume, but by the courage to speak truth when it matters most. And yet, even with applause, memes, and headlines, the story wasn't over. The room, the people, the nation were still waiting for the full consequences, the broader cultural and political shifts that this singular moment had set into motion. The tension remained, humming just beneath the surface. What Crockett had unleashed with one line was not merely a victory in a debate. It was a ripple that promised to become a wave, sweeping through the institutions, the public consciousness, and the corridors of power. The narrator closes the scene with measured intensity. The aftermath had begun, and the world was watching. But the question remained, how would this moment shape what came next? As the applause and viral clips continued to echo through the halls of social media and the chambers of power, Jasmine Crockett sat with a quiet dignity that contrasted sharply with the chaos she had left in her wake. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't seek personal glory, and she didn't celebrate the moment as a triumph over Patel. Instead, she allowed the exchange to stand as a demonstration of something far greater than a single debate, a testament to courage, integrity, and the enduring power of service. The lesson was simple but profound. Arrogance and bluster, no matter how loudly proclaimed, can never outweigh preparation, composure, and truth. Patel had believed that mockery could silence her, that volume could substitute for insight, that a sneer could intimidate a woman whose life had been defined by standing tall in the face of adversity. But Crockett's calm, measured response illuminated a deeper truth. Those who serve others with dedication and empathy possess a strength that cannot be undermined by theatrics or deceit. It was a moment that resonated far beyond the chamber walls. For the immigrant families who saw her story mirrored in their own struggles, Crockett's victory was a beacon of possibility. For women who had been dismissed, overlooked, or underestimated, it was a reminder that composure, knowledge, and conviction are formidable weapons. And for the broader public, it became a clarion call. Dignity and moral clarity are not outdated virtues. They are the foundation upon which meaningful leadership is built. The ripple effects were immediate and visible. Conversations shifted from trivial jabs to the substance of character, from spectacle to accountability. Where Patel's arrogance had once dominated discourse, Crockett's example reframed the narrative. People began to see leadership not as a performance of ego, but as a commitment to principles that uplift communities rather than self-interest. Her single line had become a moral touchstone, a reference point for what courage looks like in action. Narrator, in that moment, Crockett didn't just silence Patel. She reminded America and the world that true power lies not in the ability to intimidate, but in the willingness to serve. That strength is measured not in smirks or sneers, but in the courage to speak the truth, even when it is inconvenient, uncomfortable, or contested. The symbolism extended even further. Crockett's restraint, her refusal to retaliate with anger, and her focus on principles over personal vendetta reinforced an idea that resonates deeply with those striving for justice. Leadership is not about domination, it is about uplift. Her actions turned a viral moment into a lasting lesson, inspiring both the audience present in that chamber and the millions watching online. Even as the headlines celebrated her one-line takedown, the real story lay in what she represented: a model of courage, persistence, and integrity that could outshine arrogance and entitlement. It was a reaffirmation that society thrives when the marginalized are heard, when the diligent are recognized, and when truth is allowed to stand unshaken. The narrator closes with a reflective tone. Jasmine Crockett's moment was more than a debate victory. It was a reminder that in a world too often captivated by noise, the quiet power of truth, dignity, and service can leave the most lasting mark. Her words were not just heard, they were felt, and their impact will continue to ripple far beyond the cameras, beyond the headlines, and into the lives of everyone who dares to believe that courage, not arrogance, defines greatness. The stage was set, the lesson delivered, and yet the audience remained on the edge of their seats, knowing that the story was far from over. What came next would be shaped not just by politics, but by the values Crockett had so clearly embodied in a single, unforgettable moment. The room had settled, but the echoes of that confrontation were still reverberating across the nation. Jasmine Crockett had done more than silence Kash Patel. She had carved a moment into history, a reminder that integrity, courage, and service can prevail over arrogance and self-interest. The story wasn't just about politics. It was about values, identity, and the kind of leadership that uplifts rather than diminishes. For the viewers watching from home, the lesson was clear. Dignity matters, preparation matters, and your voice, when used with purpose and conviction, can challenge even the most entrenched arrogance. Crockett's example served as a reminder that no matter who tries to belittle you, your experience, your principles, and your resolve have the power to cut through noise and reshape narratives. This was a moment to reflect, to feel inspired, and to act. The applause in the chamber and the virality online were not just celebrations of one person's victory. They were a call to everyone who has ever been underestimated, ignored, or silenced. You too have a voice, and when you speak with conviction, it can resonate far beyond the immediate moment. So as the dust settles on this confrontation, remember what mattered most: courage over fear, truth over bluster, service over ego. And remember, moments like these are amplified when shared. Spread the story, let others see that dignity can prevail, and that standing firm is never in vain. If you believe in the power of courage, if you are inspired by leaders who refuse to back down in the face of arrogance, join the conversation. Subscribe, share, and be part of the movement that values truth, identity, and resilience. The story doesn't end here. It's only the beginning of a larger fight for what's right, and your voice can be part of it.